Some of the most beloved movies of all times are actually, well, terrible.
You must be kidding, aren't you?
Having been heavily criticized at the time of their original release, opinions of some terrible movies have improved over time, and they've developed a cult following as a result. These movies are known as cult classics, and in this video we'll take you through 10 great examples in chronological order, starting with a 1968 release and ending with one from 2004. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button. It's the best way of keeping up to date with all of Screen Rant's great new videos.
And wonderful. It seems when
Barbarella. Barbarella is the 1968 science fiction movie. It was based on the French comic series of the same name that was created by Jean-Claude Forest. Directed by Roger Vadim and starring Jane Fonda, the movie is about the titular space traveler and representative of the United Earth government being sent to find scientist Duran Duran, which is where the new wave British band Duran Duran got their name from. It performed relatively well, particularly in the United Kingdom, where it was the year's second highest grossing movie. But the fact is, it really wasn't very good. It had a poor script, a relatively dull storyline, and its attempts at being funny fell very, very flat. Mainly because of the fact that the movie's actors weren't remotely adept at performing comedy. And some critics have even described the movie as nasty and essentially just a shrewd piece of exploitation. It has, however, gone on to become a bona fide cult classic, and contemporary movie critics have been particularly complimentary about its visuals and cinematography. In fact, its most modern popularity has resulted in rumors of sequels, remakes, and other adaptations going into production. And while none of them have come to fruition yet, there's still a chance they could happen in the future.
You want to show me how you play with the chicks?
The Warriors. The Warriors is a 1979 action thriller movie that was actually based on Saul Urich's 1965 novel of the same name. It was directed by Walter Hill and starred the likes of Michael Beck, James Remar, Brian Tyler, and David Harris as members of the titular New York gang, as they were forced to make an urban journey of 48 kilometers from north end of the Bronx to their home turf in southern Brooklyn, after being framed for the murder of a highly respected gang leader. In spite of what you might think of it now, The Warriors was heavily criticized when it was first released, and particularly when you actually analyze it based on what you would expect from it, really isn't very good. The main criticisms were that it had poor dialogue, and in spite of the fact it was supposed to be an action movie, it was more like a set piece or a ballet of stylized male violence. These days, however, it's incredibly popular, has a massive cult following. In fact, such is the movie's popularity, a video game based on it was released as recently as 2005, with several of the original actors returning to perform their characters' voices.
I have existed from the morning of the world, and I shall exist until the last star falls from the heavens.
Caligula. When a movie's director disowns his own project in post-production, you know it must be really terrible. And that's what happened with 1979's erotic historical drama, Caligula. Tinto Brass served as the movie's director, but having realized that it turned out nothing like he expected it to, he wanted nothing to do with it and was ultimately only credited for principal photography. X-rated hardcore scenes were edited in sneakily after Brass had completed his work, and the movie's tone and style were altered dramatically, which disgusted both him and critics alike. The movie, which focused on the rise and fall of the Roman Emperor Caligula and starred Helen Mirren, Peter O'Toole, and Malcolm McDowell in the titular role, was described as sickening. Utterly worthless, shameful trash by Robert Ebert. Oof. In fact, it was one of the only movies Ebert ever walked out of, having only managed to stomach the first 2 hours of its 170-minute runtime. These days, however, it's gone on to be regarded as a cult classic. But unlike many other cult classics, its reviews haven't improved over time. It's still seen as perverse and indulgent, throwing in scenes of gratuitous sex and violence whenever the plot threatens to get remotely interesting. C.H.U.D. C.H.U.D, which stands for Cannibalistic Humanoid Underground Dweller or Contamination Hazard Urban Disposal, depending on who you ask, is a 1984 American science fiction horror movie. It was directed by Douglas Cheek and starred John Hurd and Daniel Stern, both of Home Alone fame, as well as Christopher Curry. The movie follows a New York City police officer and a homeless shelter manager as they join forces to investigate the disappearances of a number of people who they discover who have been taken and eaten by hideous humanoid monsters that live below the city. The monsters in question turn out to be humans who had been mutated into flesh-eating creatures by radioactive chemical waste. Words like unwatchable were used to describe it, and it was particularly criticized for being funny rather than scary, even though it wasn't intended to be a comedy horror like Ghostbusters or Gremlins from the same year. Since then, the movie has attracted a cult following, and references to it have been made on many occasions in a variety of pop culture sources. The CW's The Flash, Aqua Teen Hunger Force, Clerks 2, Castle, Archer, and even The Simpsons have all made references to C.H.U.D. Bloodsport. 1998's Bloodsport was a martial arts movie starring Jean-Claude Van Damme, Donald Gibb, Leah Aries, and Enter the Dragon's Bolo Young. Directed by Newt Arnold, the movie is supposedly based on a true story and follows the exploits of Van Damme's character, a U.S. Army captain, Frank Dux, after he receives an invite to enter the Kumite, an illegal underground martial arts tournament in Hong Kong with participants representing all manner of different fighting styles. Dux defeats a plethora of talented and ruthless fighters to reach the final against Young's formidable character Chong Li, whom he beats after being blinded by a crushed salt pill to win the tournament, becoming the first Westerner to do so. The movie was slated terribly by critics, who were far from complimentary about the awful acting and the unrelenting cliches. Most of them did enjoy the fight scenes, though. Bloodsport did spawn 3 sequels, however. Although they were all even worse than the original, were all released direct-to-video and Van Damme didn't have anything to do with them, these days it's seen as a cult classic and has legions of fans, and that's fair enough, as Hollywood really doesn't make movies like this anymore.
When did the Mongols rule China?
I don't know. I just work here.
Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. I know what you're thinking. How dare we include Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure in a list of terrible movies? It's totally bodacious and triumphant. In other words, I never want to say again. But you know what? It was terrible. The 1989 science fiction comedy buddy movie was directed by Stephen Herrick and starred Keanu Reeves, Alex Winter, and George Carlin. And while it provided a few laughs and was a commercial success, critics really didn't like it. Many thought it was incredibly dumb and was nothing more than a stoner movie, and its depiction of several important historical characters was nothing short of insulting. All that said, it's incredibly popular and is now definitely considered to be a cult classic. A sequel, Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey, was released 2 years later in 1991, and there is talk of more to this day. Of course, Keanu Reeves is now 53 years old. Alex Winter is 52, and George Carlin sadly passed away back in 2008. So any more movies in the franchise would be very, very different to this one, and that would probably be a very good thing, given that it really wasn't great, all things considered. Tank Girl. Given the incredible popularity of superhero movies these days, it wouldn't be right for us to go through a whole video like this without including at least one, and that is where Tank Girl comes in. The 1995 movie was based on the British comic book series of the same name that was first published by Titan Comics in the late 1980s. It was directed by Rachel Talalay and starred Lori Petty in the titular role, with the likes of Ice-T, Malcolm McDowell, and Naomi Watts in supporting roles, but it really wasn't very good. It was set in 2022 Australia, years after a comet strike had left the country drought-ravaged, and it follows the titular anti-hero as she and her allies fought against Water and Power, an oppressive corporation led by the evil Kesley. It was unconventional and can't be criticized for trying something new, but it simply wasn't a very engaging movie, and most of its attempts at comedy fell particularly flat. In modern times, however, it is regarded as something of a cult classic, particularly with regards to its feminist following, and it's become far more appreciated now during an era in which comic book movies are the in thing in Hollywood.
Okay?
God, the characters are lame. I'm a loser. I wish I was dead. Oh!
Freddy Got Fingered. It's only fitting that we include this movie on this list, because 2001's Freddy Got Fingered has been described by critics as the worst movie ever made. It was written by, directed by, and stars Tom Green, and it was undoubtedly a big factor in why we don't really see much of that guy anymore. The movie followed Green's character, Gordy, a 28-year-old slacker with aspirations of becoming a professional cartoonist. That sounds like a solid base to start with, but it was basically just 87 minutes of absolute, beautiful, perfect nonsense. To say it was scraping at the bottom of the entertainment barrel would be a massive understatement. Many of the jokes were offensive, most of them were just plain unfunny, and it included scenes like Gord tying sausages to his fingers while playing the piano poorly and singing, "Daddy, would you like some sausage?" Movies don't really get much worse, and it was rightfully lambasted universally by critics. And yet it now has a cult following. It has been described by Opie of Opie and Anthony fame as one of the funniest movies ever made. And Green is considered releasing a director's cut due to its popularity. If that doesn't prove that Hollywood's a crazy place, nothing ever will.
Did not hit her. I did not. Oh, hi, Mark.
The Room. The Room is a 2001 drama that centers around a very melodramatic love triangle between a banker named Johnny, his deceptive and incredibly sexy fiancée Lisa, and his conflicted and incredibly busy best friend Mark. It was directed by Tommy Wiseau, who also wrote, produced, and indeed starred in the film, and it's considered to be one of the worst movies of all time. A large chunk of the film is dedicated to a bunch of completely unrelated subplots, most of which are left unresolved due to its inconsistent narrative structure, and that makes for an extremely messy movie-watching experience. Critics absolutely hated it too. Everything from the movie's acting, its screenplay, its dialogue, its production values, its score, its direction, and its cinematography were panned to death. And yet, rather remarkably, it has since developed an international cult following. Actor Greg Sestero's memoir of the making of The Room, The Disaster Artist, was co-written with Tom Bissell and published in 2013. A movie based on that memoir was released in 2017, and an unofficial video game adaptation, The Room Tribute, was released on Newgrounds.com in 2010. For a movie that cost $6 million to make and only brought in $1,900 at the box office, all of that's pretty amazing. If you haven't watched it, seriously, go now.
Can I try it really quick?
Napoleon Dynamite. 2004's Napoleon Dynamite was quirky and eccentric to say the least. In fact, it was downright weird. Directed by Jared Hess, it followed the exploits of the titular character, who was played by Jon Heder. And it also starred Aaron Ruel, Tina Majorino, Efren Ramirez, and John Grise. Napoleon was a strange and socially awkward chap who lived his life a little differently to others. But the movie sees him finding his happy place. And while it's fair to say that some people loved the movie from the moment it was released, critics weren't quite sure what to make of it, and some absolutely hated it. Roger Ebert, for example, complained that the movie makes no attempt to make Napoleon likable, and that it contained a kind of studied stupidity that sometimes passes as humor. It did well at the box office, however, and these days it couldn't be more loved. It's developed a huge cult following. A ton of Napoleon Dynamite merchandise is still on sale, and there was even an animated television series back in 2012, although it was canceled fairly quickly by, you guessed it, Fox. And to think Jon Heder was only originally paid $1,000 to star in the movie. Gosh! And that's the end of our video. Did you enjoy it? Which other terrible films ended up becoming cult classics? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Screen Rant for more great videos just like this one. Bye for now.